Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Next Door Net Admin. I got an interesting comment the other week that said, can you talk about the pros and cons of double NAT with modern hardware? And I had to sit and think for a little while, and I went, isn't it all con? I don't see any benefits to this whatsoever. So I sat down and I thought about it for a while, and here's what I came up with. Pros. There aren't many, in my opinion. But if, and this is a really, really strong if you're looking for lazy, really lazy, suboptimal security, then maybe double NAT is more secure? Sort of. I have to point out that security in this regard is not something that NAT was ever meant to provide. Security is provided by a firewall. Regardless of the addresses that traffic are going to or coming from, a firewall is what inspects that and decides whether the traffic should pass or not. NAT kind of became what one government auditor once described as poor man's firewall because of how it works. Network address translation, as we know, changes the address when it passes from private internal networks to public external networks. If you don't have the private address, the thinking is, then there's no way to address that endpoint, and you can't talk to it directly. So anybody that's just talking to the external device, the traffic doesn't go anywhere into the internal network. But if you're not running a firewall, a proper firewall, then it's not like you're doing any sort of inspection to actually block that. You're just relying on the properties of NAT. And for some people, that has become their security. So if that has happened to you, then I could see somebody going, okay, well, double NAT means that there's two layers of that, so it's even more difficult for somebody to penetrate my external network and address my internal devices. So much the better. But from a network administrator's perspective, that doesn't fly. That just does not happen. You need a firewall. NAT was always very much a crutch. It was meant to forestall the use. IPv4 networks were assigned. They started out originally being assigned in huge chunks. You could get a Class A network with 16.7 million addresses. You could get a Class B network with 65,000. If, for example, you needed 100,000, there wasn't such a thing as, okay, well, allocate a /15 instead. That was something that came later with CIDR, or CEDAR, depending on how you pronounce it. Classless interdomain routing. CIDR. Before that, you only allocated it in chunks of either a /8, /16, /24. Class A, B, or C. Class D being multicast and Class E being reserved. So because of that, anytime you needed something like 100,000 addresses, well, that didn't fit in a Class B, so you were allocated a Class A instead. Fine, but there's only 126 Class A networks out there. And if you didn't need 16.7 million addresses, okay, you needed 100,000. What are you going to do with the other 16.6 million? Nothing. So, because of this, there were several things that were brought in to forestall the day when IPv4 would be completely exhausted and nothing could be allocated. CIDR helped a lot, variable subnetting. being able to carve your subnet down to a smaller degree so that you didn't waste a whole pile of addresses. That helped. But that came with other things such as more routes in your BGP tables, like I talked about last week, more entries in your administrative, who's looking after which network, who's looking after which prefixes, all of that. Another technology that was used was, okay, maybe everybody doesn't need a public address. Maybe we can do something so that all of the little public networks don't require a public IP address. It was probably okay back when it was dial-up because people would only dial in when it was necessary. But you also had some things that like you had a local network, that's great. Anytime you needed an internet connection, you would have to have the router dial out. On demand. Maybe you would get one IP address, maybe you would have a pool of IP addresses that could be used and shuffled among a bunch of different stations. However you managed it, NAT was another one of those transition technologies to help prolong the amount of time that you could make IPv4 work. And in North America, we're still really hanging on to IPv4 like it's, a lifeline. The rest of the world, they're on IPv6 now because there's no more IPv4 that's available. That kind of got hogged by North America, and they're the ones that are still hanging on to it. So network address translation works remarkably well these days, but it's still a crutch. A lot of systems, for example, how do you do NAT? If you're really thinking about it, well, aren't you just changing the destination address or the source address if it's coming back in? Aren't you just changing that in the packet of the header? Not necessarily. For some older games, they would actually encode the public IP address, or what they thought was the public IP address, in the game traffic itself, not in the packet of the header. So if that's the case, your router may not understand your game, and your game may or may not have the ability for you to go in and specify, actually, this is my external IP, this is what I want you to put in there. So in that case, because your gateway doesn't understand your game's internal structure, it had to resort to pattern matching. And a gateway would have to read through the entire packet to look for a string of data that happened to match the IP address, and it would just swap that out. That would work, but it also led to other things like, for example, a BitTorrent. If you happen to have a string of data that matches the bit pattern of this particular IP address, which, remember, does not necessarily come with dots, we're just talking about a binary pattern that we interpret in breaking it down into 4 parts and then converting those 4 parts individually to numbers. But when you're pattern matching at the machine level, you're just looking for a string of 32 bits that has this pattern. If that string of 32 bits with that pattern occurs in your data, then your gateway will swap it out with the updated pattern, which for some time was an issue that might strike in a BitTorrent, and you'd get a piece of your torrent that would never actually complete because it would always be modified by your gateway or by the gateway on the other end because it was an overzealous NAT corrupting the data by good-naturedly going, oh, well, you don't mean that string of data, you want this string of data. NAT does that a lot. For other things like UDP, which is connectionless, Sometimes your port translations don't work quite the way that they're supposed to. Your translations might time out in a way that the end system is still leaving them open, but the midpoint device, the gateway, may close that translation and drop it from its table, and therefore the connection closes, or it has to be reset. Double natting now takes takes two layers of this. It's not just one gateway that's in the way anymore, that's meddling with this traffic. It's two of them. And one of them, usually, is something that you can't fix because it's not under your control. If it was under your control, you'd probably eliminate it and say, one layer of NAT is quite enough, thank you very much. Or you'd put an internal firewall there and just deal with firewalled traffic instead of NATed traffic. Bypassing NAT in order to exchange traffic between two endpoint systems can be very problematic. Again, Tailscale has put out a wonderful blog entry detailing all the finer points of how they do NAT traversal. But as an example, there are different types of NAT. You can have a NAT that says, okay, everything going out port 80 is going out, everything from station A going out through port 80 is assigned to port 8080 on the external side. Okay. With some NATs, okay, what if I'm an unrelated station? If I just talk to port 8080, can I just go through that to the other device? Maybe. Maybe not. Okay. So maybe that port translation is locked to that endpoint? Maybe. Maybe not. Is it only locked to that endpoint? Because when I'm talking to that endpoint, okay, so my traffic on port 80 going out through port 8080, talking to that endpoint. Okay, well, what if there's a separate application on there? I'm doing this for Discord, and now I want to do this for Telegram as well. Okay, can Telegram just talk to that particular port and still get to that machine? Or, because it's part of a different connection ID, a different flow ID, does it say, oh, I'm sorry, this translation's not open to you? Now we start getting even more complicated. Port forwarding, inbound. Okay, if you want people to reach a service that you have inbound, you can do port forwarding. That's a NAT thing. If there's a second layer of NAT, if you've got carrier grade NAT that your ISP is using, you're not able to get any port forwarding through that. You will definitely never, ever, ever be able to get any of your services accessible to the outside world unless you happen to be running something like a VPN to a publicly accessible endpoint, and then have that publicly accessible endpoint do a little bit of port forwarding through the VPN tunnel, which I have done. It can work, but it's not a basic thing. It's not something that just everybody's going to do. It requires a much deeper knowledge of how does your networking function? How can I route this or proxy it if it's not routed? And where are my various layers of NAT? Where are my firewalls? Where are my translations? And how are the ports going through the whole thing? You can use a VPN, WireGuard in my case, to essentially say, this internal system at a hotel, I want people from the outside world to be able to reach this. Okay, so let's just create a WireGuard tunnel to a publicly accessible server in the cloud and just say, okay, so most of the time I want people to go directly to the cloud server. It has a web server running, and that's cool. But maybe every now and then, I want it to reach a different server that's located on site at a convention in a hotel. Okay, so then I go in and I modify Apache and I say, okay, well, now you're going to be a reverse proxy. And anybody who's reaching my web server in the cloud on this port suddenly gets redirected internally as a reverse proxy, which means Apache is now doing NAT, essentially. And it's being rerouted through a WireGuard tunnel to a web server where I am at the hotel for this convention. You can do it, but it's not simple. It's complicated. The more levels of NAT that you have to go through, the more complicated it gets. So, cons of doing double NAT, you're not going to get port forwards through it easily. You're not able to control how the pattern matching and substitution happens on the other end. Maybe it will leave some of your traffic alone and it'll only do the IP headers. Or maybe you'll be running an application that doesn't work unless it fiddles with the traffic and does pattern matching in the middle of the packet. One of those will work. It's very likely that you won't be able to have both of them work. And if you can't administer the secondary device doing that, then you can't tick the box that says, okay, do this now, and then untick it afterwards and say, okay, stop doing this now. And you don't necessarily have the ability to say, okay, this is easy NAT or this is hard NAT, and there's no way to adapt the systems to work with that. On modern hardware, it's not usually about the speed of the connection. On modern hardware, double natting is not going to be an issue necessarily for basic outbound access. You can talk to things on the internet all day. You can do it through double NAT, you can do it through triple NAT. But if for whatever reason you need people to access something within that network, that's where you start running into problems. And the more layers of NAT you have, the more difficult it's going to be. And in some cases, it might even end up being impossible. IPv6, fabulous thing. IPv6 is designed to have bucket loads and bucket loads of IP addresses. Enough IP addresses that you can have 3 IP addresses within every square, what was it? Every square foot or every square meter, I don't remember which, on the Earth's surface. Each square meter can handle 3 IP addresses, and you're good. That's a lot. That's a lot of IP addresses. It's one of the things it's designed for is to make it so that you don't need NAT anymore. You don't need to worry about port forwarding because your internal devices have a publicly addressable address. They have a publicly reachable address. People would go, a lot of people would say, well, but how is that secure? You can't, and I'm like, you should have a firewall. Just the fact that I have a global address on my desktop does not mean that everything can reach it. I tell the firewall, accept connections to port 443 for this address. Everything else, block it unless it's a response to something that I sent myself, outbound first. So allow replies, but for unsolicited connections, only accept them on this port. That's exactly what a firewall is meant to do. I like IPv6 because I can use global addresses on my internal devices, and now I don't need to worry about network address translation at all. I don't have to worry about doing pattern matching in the body of the packet. I don't have to worry about, do I have speedy equipment and modern hardware? I probably do. That substitutes the headers. I don't need to worry about, can I do port forwarding? Can I not do port forwarding? It's just, here is a device with a public address. If I want you to be able to reach it, I tell the firewall to permit it, and we're done. I don't have to worry about, well, what's the translated address and what's this and that and the other. I don't need any of it. There are some instances where people have done NAT for IPv6. I haven't been able to figure out why, if I'm honest, other than IPv6 has some local either site local or link local addresses that you can use without getting an actual IPv6 subnet allocated either from your regional internet registry, your RIR, or from your ISP, or from somebody else. Maybe you're just using a site local IPv6 subnet. Why would you want to NAT that out through a single IP address? IPv6 has lots and lots and lots of addresses. And for an ISP, I would say, well, many ISPs will already allocate you a /64 because that's the smallest that you can allocate normally. So maybe that's good enough. If I want to do VLANs, each with its own IPv6 subnet, I go to my ISP and say, hey, I've already got some static IPv4 addresses that I'm using with NAT that I paid you guys for. I'd also like a static IPv6 subnet of greater than /64. I've always asked for a /56 or higher. I've never gotten a /56. I've usually gotten a /48 because they're like, okay, well, we're just going to allocate you a /48 then because that's easier for us administratively than allocating a /56 and then hopefully a bunch of other /56s. Okay, that's up to the ISP. They're giving me more than I asked for. Fine. I'm not going to complain about it. IPv6 is good in my mind. Partly, it's good for a bunch of different reasons, but partly it's also good because it removes the need for NAT entirely. So in terms of what are the pros of double NAT, in my mind, I don't think there are many. And the list of cons is a lot longer than the list of pros. But there you are. That's my perspective on it. Hopefully you found that interesting. Sufficient answer to your question. If you have thoughts on other things that you would like to hear me talk about or things that you would like to see me demonstrate, feel free to let me know right down there in the comments section. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching. I am your next door NetAdmin, and we will see you next time.